From December 2009 to August 2010, I served as a civilian advisor with the United States Department of Defense in Afghanistan, where I worked with U.S. Army units and Special Forces teams, provincial reconstruction teams, USAID, and State Department civilians and innumerable NATO staff officers within Kabul and mostly across eastern Afghanistan. I would be remiss to note that the many Afghans that worked with us took incredible personal risks upon themselves toward making their country a better place for their family and their children. And it is from them that I learned more about sacrifice, family, endurance, and hope than I have from any other experience thus far. As of yesterday at 10 o'clock, 1,255 members of the U.S. military have been killed in Afghanistan since 2001, and 9,240 have been wounded. These statistics represent not only the Americans who paid the ultimate sacrifice to serve the greatest country in the world, but also a belief in a country that provides many of us with absolutely incredible opportunities, such as the event we find ourselves here today. And I thank you, Wolfgang, for bringing another conference together successfully. These sacrifices also represent countless American families who did not expect to lose their loved ones, or the families who lost a loved one in the attacks on September 11th, or the innumerable Afghans that have had to endure a civil war for decades. But the United States does not shoulder this burden of these conflicts equitably. And on this Veterans Day weekend, I would like to thank everyone who has taken part in these wars, either in uniform or as a supportive family member back home, in addition to the future veterans, like the ones Wolfgang invited to the reception last evening. Next year's 10th anniversary of September 11th will mark a period of intense reflection across the United States. From a national security perspective, it provides us an opportunity to assess if the endeavors of the last decade, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the global terrorist threats, have truly prepared the United States for the challenges of the next: counterproliferation, ethnic population migration, extremism, failing states, shifting economic resources, informational power, and the rise of near-peer competitors. For these reasons and many others, it is imperative to synthesize, discuss, and communicate whether or not the tremendous sacrifices given by the families in the United States, our allies, and patriotic Afghans, all in the name of security, have really made us more secure. In my personal opinion, I do not think that's the case. Only in the past 10 months has the United States settled on a strategy that could mostly stabilize Afghanistan, depending on your definition of stability. The strategy could allow Afghanistan to become asserting a durable central government within the next few years, specifically by focusing on developing key districts, empowering and mentoring government officials, and training a national military police force. The strategy is both in line with a decentralized approach to governance that is familiar to Afghan culture, and also one that leverages the personal relationships and trust necessary for the local population to start believing they have a voice. But it has taken the United States 9 years to get to this point, and many can legitimately ask if Afghanistan and the United States are truly better off. It is also increasingly difficult to make the argument that NATO's current efforts in Afghanistan are within its strategic interests to justify the money and personal sacrifices the conflict currently requires. With the original terrorist threat in Afghanistan eliminated many years ago, our counterterrorism strategy has gradually been succumbed into one of nation building. Today, the insurgents left in Afghanistan are largely criminals, hooligans, and power brokers that have long been the sources of stability and instability in their community. In some places, merely our continued presence in fortified military bases incites hatred and creates the next generation of enemies. These lessons are not new. They are echoed in history. During a 1986 Politburo meeting in Moscow, Sergei Akromiev, the chief of staff of the Soviet Armed Forces, said of Afghanistan, "There is not one military objective that has been posed and not achieved, but there is still no result. The problem is that the military results are not being reinforced by political ones." At the same time, U.S. actions in Afghanistan increasingly undermine the central government we are seeking to support. The Afghan government has limited capacity to govern, but after 9 years, everyone must recognize that there is a capacity, one that in many cases is a comparable alternative to Taliban rule. No, Afghan officials cannot tackle every important step in building a safe and secure nation. in parallel, nor does every one of their policies agree with what the United States wants. But when the Afghan government makes a decision on its own, whether at the national, provincial, or district level, sometimes the United States often fails to support an assertive sovereign government, often by opposing its policy or insisting we be consulted on its development. And a key part of counterinsurgency is realizing when to step back and let the Afghans take charge. So I would like to pose 4 questions for consideration as we look forward to the future of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Question 1, why is the United States still in Afghanistan? Despite the United States' current efforts, there has been little discussion as to whether nation building is something the U.S. government should be doing or developing the capacity to employ against future challenges. Future engagement in nation building would be an important foreign policy precedent that institutions such as the Liechtenstein Institute should actively debate. Question 2, why is the military engaged in nation building? This goes back to our earlier discussion. Less and less of what the U.S. military is doing in Afghanistan resembles an inherent military function. Our battalion commanders are spending the majority of their time as development and government project managers. I personally believe the overall level of violence would decrease if the military disengaged from most areas and empowered the development and stabilization missions to USAID, NGOs, and other development agencies. And I agree that Vice President Biden was probably right. Question 3, why is counterinsurgency our civil military strategy of choice? The tipping point of counterinsurgency is realizing when one no longer needs to be involved, analyzing at what point the military can transition to civilian agencies, and evaluating when those civilian agencies can transition to the sovereign government. The U.S. government has so far been unwilling or unable to create such a narrative. And in many parts of Afghanistan, the U.S. military is faltering because of the difficulty transitioning from counterinsurgency to security assistance, development, and governance. There are likely few places in Afghanistan where counterinsurgency is an effective tactic. And finally, question 4, why should we be wary of institutionalizing the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan? The tragedy of Iraq and Afghanistan is our country's failure to recognize the encroachment of militarism. We are witnessing an increasingly reliance on giving 18 and 19-year-old Americans weapons and ordering them to solve our foreign policy problems at the expense of other elements of national power, which is counterproductive to our long-term security. Our soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen who have gone to Iraq and Afghanistan trained to kill an enemy, who are serving honorably and with incredible self-sacrifice, are relegated to development, governance, and force protection missions that could all be better performed by trained civilians. Many U.S. civilian agencies are reluctant or without the resources to engage in this. Hopefully, the sun is setting on sustained U.S. military engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while it is difficult to say that leaving Afghanistan would make us less safe, it is equally as difficult to argue that the conflict in Afghanistan has made the United States safer. On the horizon, we can see our next irregular threats: Yemen, Pakistan, Sudan, and Iran. And as the United States seeks to balance its future national security challenges, economic priorities, and moral obligations as a leading military power, it would do us well to evaluate what our experience in Afghanistan has taught us about culture, religion, extremism, nation building, and the limitations of foreign influence upon a sovereign nation. As we continue to reflect on the importance and meaning of the future in Afghanistan and our collective involvement, I conclude on this Veterans Day weekend with a quote from George Orwell that adorned my office in Afghanistan. This is mostly for Wolfgang's benefit, but I think it is in stark contrast to your Socrates quote. "We sleep safe in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to visit violence on those who would do us harm." Thank you.